Welcome to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. I'm Elizabeth Townsend-Gard, your host. I'm a law professor at Tulane University Law School and a LePage faculty fellow at the A.B. Friedman School of Business at Tulane, and I just want to quilt. So this is part 2 of 2 of the Carolyn Ducey interviews. Now, the first one we did a while back, and this one we did this week. This one is about quilt history and quilt blocks. And again, she is the Curator of Collections for the International Quilt Museum.
Sure. I'm Carolyn Ducey. I'm calling from the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Awesome. So let's start with a question of how do you conceive of quilt history? Do you see like the history of quilts as chunks of time? Sort of how do you sort of, if someone is listening and if you are okay with us broadcasting it once as part of the research notes, how do we understand the role of history, quilt history, in sort of our world today? That's a lot of questions. Just sort of let's get started on kind of the role of quilt history.
The role of quilt history. Well, I think, quilt history is still relatively new. I mean, it's a new field. And I think the role that we started out with was really looking back at what had been written in early books of the 20th century, which was some of the first history books, and addressing some of the myths that they had set up. Because when I started really getting into quilts back in the 80s and 90s, we still had a lot of really a lot of misconceptions about what quilts were, where they came from. We still believed it was an American art form. It was just really rife with a lot of, romanticized kind of visions of what our quilt history was. So I think early on, it was just really a big part of it was just kind of going back, relooking at what had been said, and trying, at least for us as an institution particularly, being very, very careful about putting things out that were fact, not myth, not maybe. You'll see if you look at our exhibitions, our information, we use a lot of possiblies and probablys. So what we were really trying to do was to put a reliable source out that would give people information that they could count on. And so we would always ask ourselves, how do we know what we know? Do we know it because we have information or we have research that supports it? How do we know that? So I think that's what we really started out with. But I think on the other side of that too, was just the idea that there is so much out there to research, that quilt history is just wide open and we really need to really just dive in. And so the American Quilt Study Group is, of course, the first research-oriented program that really started looking at quilts. And that's where most of our really great research was coming out of that, a peer-reviewed publication. And a lot of our students, I think, for 10 or 12 years, we had at least a student or someone working with our collection giving a paper at AQSG every single year. We had a really great run, and probably more than that even. So it was really exciting to see our students just kind of jump into areas that they were interested in and really illuminate them. So at that point, quilt history became, I think, much more wide open. We weren't reacting against something anymore. Now we were just doing really solid, great research.
And what, in terms of that, like when you talk about quilt history, what do you mean exactly by that? What do you like, is it, I think some people think it's just like documenting a particular block, but it's bigger than that, I think, right?
Oh, yeah. If I were to give my little elevator speech, it would be like, that's what I find fascinating about quilting is quilting can really reflect really on almost any of our American history particularly, and we're just beginning to realize how much it can reflect other international and global histories. But really, you can look at things as wide as the Industrial Revolution. You can look at women's culture, women's history. I think the quilts give you a window into any kind of large topic like that. So what we have done, at least on our website, for example, with our World Quilt site, is we've approached things more thematically rather than trying to narrow things down into a particular time frame or a particular type of quilt by looking at things like how society reacted to quilts, how technology impacted quilts, how quilts reflected the social and cultural issues of their time, political issues. So we look at it in that way, which I think is a really exciting way to look at it because it doesn't limit you so much with these really firm parameters. So we've done that. But I think, to me, quilt history is about this. I look at it probably in the really large picture, because as a curator of a collection and a collection that's being built, we're trying to get a little of everything across time and across space. So that suits me. I can tell you a little bit about dye technology, but not much. Right. I've taken classes, but I don't have that solidly down. I can tell you a little bit about the history of a particular block, but I may not be able to tell you a lot about it. So my role is to have that really overarching view. And to me, it's all about women's history, minorities' histories, just history of what was being done in homes. Yeah. And so an art form that was really dear to people's heart is really, I guess, what it comes down to at its most basic.
So interesting. Okay. So time periods. So we've got like Civil War quilts. We've got like the 1930s. Like we know like what certain things look like, and we name them. So how do we understand, like, if someone is listening and they're like, I want to understand, like how do you identify the periods of quilting? Do you have a sort of is there a standard scheme for that, or is it not?
You know, what I think we're missing in the quilt world is some of these standard schemes. You know, some of these, you know, a volume that would tell us how the terminology that we're all sharing and using, but we're using different technology, meaning the same things. I don't think that's been written or done yet, and I think that would be really valuable. But when we look at timeframes, it's really a matter of, for example, we have 2 books out. We have that cover our entire collection from 16. Let me get my head straight. 1760 to the 1940s. And in those books, you can really see how we broke them down by basic styles. So you would have your pieced quilts, your applique quilts, chintz applique, inscribed quilts, red and green. You know, we did break it down into certain categories that we know are occurring, because there really is, if you'll pardon the pun, a thread through all of these different styles. So you see really, when you are able to look at collections, and that's one of the things that the digital world has done for us, is to be able to really look at a lot of quilts, you really do begin to see the trends that are occurring and what is popular at a certain time, particularly, and what I think one of the most exciting developments is these regional styles that come out of different areas and different time periods. So you see lots and lots of quilts being made in the same way, which makes a lot of sense, because that basic reach of those quilters and the influence and the patterns that are available to them is kind of in a discrete area. It's not until about the 1900s when women's publication, I guess a little earlier than that.
That's the big moment, right? So it's like this 1870, 1880 to like 1940, where we have this new sort of, the magazine and the newspaper is nationalized and huge and like everywhere, right?
Right.
And it seems like that also spurs on, not like standardization is not quite the right word, but like everybody's starting to see the same patterns because it's in the farmers, whatever, you know, like there's all the, like it's a Chicago Tribune or like the different places that you're sort of seeing that. Is that, am I right on that? That there's a kind of at that
I think that definitely has a national impact, but I think that standardization was happening regionally long before that, because just in a different way, because people were still following what was in fashion, following trends. They were much more sophisticated than I ever really thought of until I started really delving in. So you really do see trends, certain types of quilts being made. So there was some standardization, but I think with publications, yes, you begin to see the fact that one publication comes out, it's super successful, it's economics, another company copies it. And especially in the early 20th century, see a lot of people borrowing. So you'll see even the same pattern reinterpreted with just subtle differences, but coming out from 3 or 4 different places. So I think there was definitely standardization. And I think the kit quilts are kind of an example of that, because they became hugely popular in the 20s and 30s and really helped kind of increase that idea of more of a similar approach done by people across the nation.
So explain what happened. Tell us a little bit more about the kit quilts in the 20s and 30s.
Well, the kit quilts were an interesting phenomenon. It started with Marie Webster back in the 19-teens. She published a couple of patterns in a woman's magazine. I think it was Woman's Day, might have been Good Housekeeping. I can't remember the magazine for sure. But it was part of this modern approach to quilt making where, and we have an exhibition called Modern Marvels that you can find on our website that really goes back into some of the major designers and the impetus. So a lot of it was just that the idea was that it was changing again. We're not going to make those crazy quilts anymore that were so popular at the turn of the century. We're going to make something new. And Marie Webster was an artist. She did beautiful Art Deco designs, beautiful quilts. And I don't even know who did it first. I believe it was Marie Webster, but she created a whole kit, which meant that you got everything you needed to make the quilt. The backing was pre-marked. You got applique pieces that you cut out and stitched in place. If you had embroidery details, you got your floss to do your embroidery. And it was billed as like an easy, quick way for women to make a quilt for their homes. But you'd open that kit up and it would have like 2 lines of instructions: cut apart and stitch in place. And so it was supposed to be this really easy thing. And what we find that is so ironic is you find quilt kits that people opened up and they appliqued about 2 pieces on.
Totally. It's like, just like now.
Yes,
just like now.
I mean, it took a lot of skills, regardless of whether you got all the pieces or not.
Funny.
And so the kits became so popular that people really just start copying. So Marie Webster's designs were done by a lot of other companies. That's when we see all the patterns and things coming out in the newspapers. It was just quite a phenomenon. And when that was one of the things that I found really interesting when I started here at the museum is we had Virginia Gunn from the University of Ohio come, and she was like, you do realize this is a kit, and this is a kit, and this is a die cut pattern. So you would get the even if it was a piece design, you would get your pre-cut pieces that you would put together. And I was just blown away because I didn't know that all of those were kits. And so we really discovered that was a really huge phenomenon in a way that we didn't know. So
it's really interesting, super interesting. So tell me a little bit. So Marie Webster starts this sort of phenomenon. Then the newspaper. So we've got, is it Nancy Cabot in the Chicago Daily Tribune putting patterns together? And there's, who is it? Ruby McKim, and then the farmer's wife. Like we've got all these things. Like I don't know how many of them there are.
There are so many more than you can imagine because we keep getting gifts of these newspaper patterns and we've tried to document them and photocopy them. And then they just keep coming and coming from these really small newspapers even. So there are huge numbers of them.
So, okay. So fascinating. That's got to be pushing it out into another, like, and then the part that's sort of amazed me, that's why I asked you to come today, is, okay, so this is how it all started. So I'm writing, right? And so every time I take a break writing, I just kind of surf a little bit and then go back to writing. So AccuQuilt has a new, is it called the Glorious 9-patch, or the one that's sort of squishy, it moves the 9-patch into like almost like a double wedding wing kind of thing. It's got, so they have this new die, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And the little video, and they're like, we know the exact date of this. It is February 1933 when Nancy Cabot put it into the Chicago Tribune. Now, of course, it isn't, right? It goes all the way back to the 1880s. You can kind of see it, but it sort of starts it's amazing, right? So from my side of it, my head is about to explode on many, many levels, because I think, okay, then I go to Kansas City. I saw on Barbara Brackman's website, amazing websites that she has. Kansas City Star, who's a very big in this, huge, right? In this, she's written a book about it, but there's a thing. They have a little copyright notice on one of the little clips that she's put on her website. So they're putting notices on it. We know the Chicago Tribune has been renewed. So like it's still under copyright, but we don't treat these patterns in any way, really. They're common. Like these blocks are common. We all use them. AccuQuilt probably, like some of them are out of copyright because they go back way far. Like the whole thing is chaotic, and it's not playing by the copyright rules, I don't think, at all. It is our public domain. It is our common pool of blocks. Do you agree with that thesis? It's kind of insane, right? Like, I don't know.
It's very problematic because we see this happen all the time. And it's one thing when you're looking at a pattern that's been around forever and someone's doing their own like piece pattern that's been around. It'd be really hard to say, oh, you're taking that from our quilt. But what we're seeing, and there's not an easy way to control our original quilts in our collection, that people are not doing necessarily in the U.S., but they're doing in other countries. And I'll get a call and somebody will be calling me from Australia saying, I can't see what's going on in the center of that quilt. Can you send me a detail shot? And I'll say, well, what are you doing with the quilt? And if somebody's making a quilt for their own sake, that's one thing. We're fine with that. You know, it's an infringement, but it's, you know, it's for their own personal pleasure, and that's fine. But then somebody will say, well, I'm developing a pattern and I need to get the pattern for this and I need the size and I need how many quilting stitch, and they want all these. And it's like,
right.
You do understand that's a copyright infringement because that's our quilt. You're using our photo.
Right.
You can sometimes track our quilts down in other photos that we have no control over, which is always interesting when you see somebody develop something from, say, a previous owner's collection or dealer's collection. They have their own photo. We don't have copyright of that photo. It's very, very murky. We don't really have the ability to track down people who are infringing on our copyright unless it was something big. And it's not a big money-making endeavor. No matter what pattern book you sell, you're not making money on it.
That's right. Okay, so let me break down this a couple of things. So the quilts that you have in your collection that are either you purchased or you've had donated, do you feel like you hold the copyright in those quilts, or do you feel like they have copyright? Do you think that it's at a particular age that it's copyrighted? I can tell you kind of my perspective on it, which is it's muddy. It's a very muddy situation.
It's very muddy.
Right?
Honestly, I can't really tell you. What I know we have copyright of is our photos. And the quilt itself and the pattern is probably in public domain.
Right. But the image,
if you call me and you tell me you're using our information or you want my photos, that's kind of a different thing. So it's very muddy. But what I always appreciate is if just somebody will get in touch with us and say, here's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
It's okay to do. And then I have people I can go to and say, you know, because there's percentages involved. How much of a percentage have you copied out of that? And how much is it exact? And will you put our name on it? And say, we have actually acquired a collection that was very odd for us because it was a woman who had made 50 different reproductions of museum quilts. And she did her own patterns for the most part, or she bought established patterns. Right. But they were from museums all over the nation. And we were kind of like, is this even legit for us to have these quilts?
Right.
We accepted them because, frankly, we wanted 2 quilts from our collection that she'd made outstanding examples of. And we really wanted those. And we opted to go ahead and do a lot of research and put a lot of time into finding out where all the other original quilts were.
Yeah.
That when we use Hortense's collection in our education collection, we identify the quilt made by her, but we say from the quilt at this museum.
Right, the attribution.
So we try to make sure it's
I would love to see that. Oh my gosh. I would just want to come play with you like forever. So yes. Can I so okay. So here's my other question. So here's my thesis. I think that it doesn't really matter what the copy. So if it got printed for the first time in the Chicago Daily Tribune or someplace else, that in many ways, we don't really care whether it's under copyright or not, because you're not looking at a particular block and saying, did that particular newspaper get renewed in its 28th year? No one's doing that in the quilting. Like, can I use this? Can I not? We think all of these blocks are ours to use. That we don't really, I think. Now, I don't know in terms of like, Lori Erin Hurd? The farmer's wife, she does all of that. I don't know if she's like getting a license to use those from the people that own the magazine. Like I need to do more research on that. I don't know if Barbara Brackman is getting a license to use the Kansas City Star. When she makes a book of it, is she working with the copyright holder of those or not? I don't know. Do you know or do people just think they can use whatever they want to use and make whatever they want to make? I don't know about that.
I think when it comes to publishing a book, I think that, like Barbara Brackman, I'm sure is very aware that she's got to check who owns those patterns and make sure she's done it, because she could get called on really easily, and she publishes a lot of books, so she does
that. That's right.
I think that
she's been on before, so
Yeah. And I think when it comes to a publication like that, if you're going to reprint it, then yes, I think you need to know. Right. But there are so many pattern books out. I am boggled. We just had a collection of 900 quilts given to us, and the majority of them are how-to books with patterns. And it is ridiculous that there are just hundreds of books. So, and if you do something in a different color, are you really copying it? If somebody puts out a pattern in a book and you buy the book, you've got their permission to use that pattern however you want.
That's right. And also, we don't even know how much is protectable in that. So we don't protect directions. If the blocks are common blocks that aren't protected, then sure, the book itself is protected, but not really much of else is. Like the selection, arrangement, and coordination of the book and the pictures and all that, you can't make a copy and sell that book, but you can pretty much do anything else. Even the kind of commercial restrictions, there's just not, I don't know. I just don't think it. So, okay. So that's my first thing, trying to trace back this one block to see the glorious 9 patch, to understand copyright on it. Like, is there, and then I move forward. So I get that. I say in my little head as I'm writing, I say, okay, common blocks that are named, that have a Brackman number, that are just part of our world, is a common resource. And we don't pay somebody or ask permission to make the glorious 9 patch. We don't ask because it's part of our common pool of knowledge, and that's totally okay. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yeah. So let's fast forward. So we get then Tula Pink puts out her 100 block book, and then Angie Wilson, the Gnome Angel, has her new version of modern blocks. And so when I think about this, I think, well, if we're not going to determine the copyright status of these blocks and trace each block to make sure it's out of copyright for real, which most of them are still under copyright potentially because of sort of the way copyright law works, then you have to do the same thing for the moderns. You can't have one rule for the older stuff that's still under copyright and not have the same rules for the stuff that's new in copyright, because that, just the physics of it, it's like having 2 children, you can't be like, yes, you can have dessert, but no, you can't have dessert. Right. So I think that's really interesting too. And so my question then, so we're going to look at those blocks and see if we can find other versions of them that are, take the 2 books or take the 2 patterns of them and see if we can find in Brackman versions of them that are already there. Is anything new? That's the question, right? Is there anything really new or not? Has it already been done? Does it just look new because we put it in kind of a thing? But, okay, so here's my problem. Okay, I get the blocks. We're not going to deal with applique because that's just messy and crazy. But at what point does something become copyrightable? At what point is it something enough that it's more than just the basic block, right? Is it because you put it in a certain way or you added certain fabric? You feel protective of the works that are in your collection in some ways because of the object the object or the copyright. Or when does copyright start, in terms of these things? And I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know that I do either.
Yeah.
I think that, if you're doing a how-to book and you've put your patterns out there, that's what it's there for people.
So the book gets copyright.
That's one thing.
That's right.
Now,
that's
obviously,
I'm cool with that. That's easy, right?
And that's the sum total of the book and all that. But there's still, I think that anytime you're putting out a book where you're publishing patterns, they're going to be used, and that you've got to know that. And so I don't think you can copyright that. Right. I don't know what the percentages are or how you judge if someone just does it with a different color or different fabric. I think that's kind of inherent in what we do as quilt makers, and it's always been that way. So I don't feel like that is something that should influence copyright, though.
So you don't feel like
the specific fabric line, maybe it could.
Right. So if I take this glorious 9 patch and I make my version, which is going to be awesome, right? You don't feel like I can lock it. I can let's say I do a rainbow version, that anybody else can do a rainbow version too. That just because I put it at some point, do you think putting common blocks together in any way sort of makes it into something that that keeps other people from doing it?
I think the total of that piece does. So if you, for example, I was using patterns from all over, but doing my unique combination. Yeah. And I saw somebody who copied every single block I'd used, and I'd taken them from all different ways or different locations. I think that could be, because that is the line, and that is the difficulty, is when does a piece become an original artwork rather than something that's incorporating patterns.
Right.
I don't know how you define that. That's what I look at, I suppose, though. And that's the ones that I'm going to be protective about, are the artists who are working today, who are making original work, which means that they're not typically using standard blocks. They may incorporate them, but it's not usually a standard block. So there's that artist that's doing something completely original that we have to protect. There are people, for example, we had a gal come in who made a really beautiful applique quilt, alphabet blocks. If some of those blocks were copied, I wouldn't have a problem. If I saw somebody who had made that exact quilt with the same border, then I feel like we're verging on that
the infringement, right?
Stealing of your design.
Yeah. And that's exactly what the court says. There's really only one case that's helpful on this, and it's an alphabet quilt, and it's manufacturer to manufacturer. So these are mass-produced quilts, alphabet quilts, and it's somebody famous that had made the original and was selling them, and it looked exactly the same. So there were 3 quilts. The first one that was infringing was identical. You could kind of see like they did exactly the same. The F was pink in this one and F was pink in the other one. They then did 2 others, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, where they had switched around stuff. So like it wasn't exactly the same and the coloring wasn't the same. It still was the same idea. And the court said, no, not infringing. So it was interesting. If you look at them and you go, yeah, those are totally copy. The court goes, yeah, you can't do that. But if you mix it up a bit, even just a little bit, you turn it from blue to green and you organize it a little bit differently, then the court's like, okay with it.
Well, isn't there a percentage somewhere where they say if you have an original work and you've copied a certain percentage of it, then you're infringing? That is a memory I have from talking to my sister, the artist.
It's a thing that kind of got going, and it was because of this weird Congress for Fair Use had sort of suggested these 10% rule thing, and then it never got implemented, so it's not law at all, but we all have in our mind, well, if we only take 10% of something or we change it up a bit. But I think in some way it does go to the spirit of it, right? That like if it has to look like yours, not like somebody else's, for it to be infringing. Okay, well that's kind of where I am. So I'm just really curious about this period of time of, I'm so amazed that you could, so it seemed like Nancy Cabot's, who that's her pen name, right? She every day had this daily which she would have one block and say something little pithy about it, not very much. And then they would say, and go buy for 5 cents the pattern at the Chicago Tribune. That to me, like the Chicago, do you have any of those patterns? That to me seems amazing that the newspaper was selling patterns. Like that's mind blowing, you know?
I think, it was the Depression especially, and I think that it was a way to get the newspapers realized that, and a lot of them actually published the pattern. You could just cut out and trace it from there. So if you were going to make a quilt, they would stretch the patterns out like one block over, this month or this week, and then you'd have to get the next newspaper. You wanted the next block. It was really a marketing tool.
It was a marketing tool.
And the strangest thing I thought I saw was when we went to Australia to an exhibit over there, we came around the corner and I was like, oh, look, it's Birds of America. And I was like, that's not because that's a very common quilt that came out as an embroidery pattern. Mm-hmm. And you could get, one pattern a week. Went up closer and it was an Australian birds that they had done. And it was a newspaper pattern that was put out the same times as ours was put out in the U.S., where once a week you got that new pattern to make your quilt. But what's really amazing, Mountain Mist was a huge company, had a huge impact. They were really amazing marketers, and they really did take Marie Webster's patterns and reproduce anything that was selling well. They would make their own version of it and almost identical. But they were out doing quilt exhibits in department stores. They were setting up windows in department stores. And then you'd go in and they would have every product you needed to buy right there. So you could buy it and leave with all your materials. They were huge marketing
It's amazing.
But that was what everybody was doing, and there was no copyright control at that time. So
that was the other question. Are these companies, so copyright really is about publisher to publisher so that they can't steal each other's stuff. But it seems like that's not being like it's like a free for all, right? So one company had, and they're naming it different things. That's why we get all the weird names. But you get this because that's part of what Brackman did, right? Is she could identify like all the different names and the places it got published.
Yeah.
And that's what's so remarkable about the crazy work she did in the 60s and 70s,
yes.
right?
Yes. Yeah. And anybody who wanted, I don't know when copyright took hold. Was it the 40s, 50s? But up until that point, it was just like literally they probably went out and bought a pattern and traced it and called it their own. It was that close, and there wasn't much anybody could do about it. And it was also just a huge market. And there were a lot of quilts being made at that time. So everybody wanted their piece of that pie. That's the other thing that is really fascinating about quilts. Quilts are always about big business. They're always about people making money.
I mean, it's so funny. I was saying that to Pam, this whole notion of like, oh, now it's commercial. It's like, no, it has this commercial base on so much of it, right? It would talk about like
from the 1600s. I was just finishing up research for a show that we're putting up that is our quilts from 1600 to 1800. And it was all about economics from day one. So.
It's amazing. Yeah. All right. I really just want to come and play forever. Like it's like the perfect intersection of everything important in the world, I think.
Well, you can come spend a couple weeks or a month with us. And
exactly. Sabbatical, right? Spring. I'm so I'm going to abandon my family and just like come hang out with you guys. I just think it's really important and really interesting and amazing. So, all right. Well, I'm going to keep writing. I feel like this is just the beginning of something bigger and like the next project, because I feel like my dissertation work is in the early 20th century. So I'm really drawn to the 1890s to the 1940s. That's like the period of time I spent all of my time in. And the fact that this is happening with quilting in this period of time is so amazing to me, that we're right back there. This kind of transformation of the nationalization and the, as you said, the marketing that you're using it to market, it's amazing. So I'm really excited.
You definitely want to check out Modern Marvels and the book American Quilts in the Modern Age is our collection from 1880 to 1940. And Maren Hansen wrote a great essay in there about just the whole modernization of the world at that time. And then it ends up with the 1940s where blankets started coming out and quilts faded out again. And so that's why my mom wasn't a quilter, because you bought blankets. They were modern. They were cool. It was like this thing to go buy blankets. So
did we not have that before that? Do we not have are blankets not really available in the same way that we think of them today?
No, I don't think they were. It was certainly my experience as growing up that all of a sudden it was like a church thing. We could go to the church and you played some kind of game. It was like what do you call it when you walk in a circle and you
duck
chairs, something like that. But you would win a blanket. And I just remember my mom, it's like quilting just became one of those things. And it's happened regularly where it comes out of fashion, where it's considered like it's old fashioned, do something different. So my mom, who did every single kind of needle art there was, from macrame to sewing to clothes to fabric paint, all of that stuff, never quilted until the last 20 years of her life. And then became the quilter in the family.
So last question then, where do you think we are? Like there's a lot of hubbub about where we are in the cycle of quilting. Do you feel like, where do you think we are right now? I mean, we know the Renaissance happens in the bicentennial and all of that, and that grows up in the commercialization and the rotary cutter and all the inventions. But where are we now? Would you say?
It's an interesting question because I feel like there's a generation in their 60s and 70s that are making lots of quilts. When I go to see the Festival of Quilts, we just came back from there. When you go to the Houston Festival, there are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of quilts that people are making. So, and it's a $25 billion a year industry, something like that, whatever. So if people are making them, but I really do wonder if it's going to continue to be something that appeals to people as they get a little bit older. The modern quilters, I think, are great because they got a younger generation involved.
Right.
But I still feel like there's going to be a drop off just because that generation is passing away. I hope not. I hope we can continue to just see other people fill in that. but it's a whole different generation. Our volunteers are of that older generation. They didn't work outside the home like most people do today. They have this intrinsic philanthropic way about them. They volunteered. They were involved in quilt groups. They did the Quilt State Research Project. I mean, they were really committed. I don't know that I see that in the generations that I'm seeing coming up now.
Well, it's interesting because I see that. I see professionals. I see people retiring as professionals that had sort of dabbled. I don't see as young. I mean, I see some young, but not super young. But I think what's interesting is Facebook and social media. So you get these huge groups, 30,000 and these huge groups of people. And I don't think that the quilt industry is capitalizing on that as much as they potentially could. And I think that, they're not going to guild meetings as much, but they're checking their Facebook pages 2 or 3 times a day, right? In our group, now we're a little research weirdo group, right? We're like a weird, strange group. We like ourselves, but we're goofy. And we have 2,500, and of that, 2,000 are active on a weekly basis. Like that tells you, if that was a guild, people would be like, "Wow, that's huge." So I think that, for me, I think that the industry has to start thinking about how to use Facebook more and Instagram as a way that this is where the community has sort of moved to, whatever age you are. And we did this poll recently about how do you quilt? Do you quilt with your friends or your family or in guilds, or are you kind of a lone wolf? And almost every single person said, yeah, I do those things, but I'm really a lone wolf. So Facebook is giving people the community that they need to not feel alone and to have a community in a way that the guilds, I think, or just going over to the neighbor's house did in the past. So I find it very encouraging, actually. To sort of see how many people are involved in quilting and involved. And it's very, it's like that neighborly stuff, right? Like, it's like, the birth of the baby, or I can't find this, or, oh my gosh, look what I had to rip out today. There's a kind of very intimate, not maybe, or informalness to it that I think is really interesting. So I'm an optimist on it, but I haven't been around that long. So, but it is interesting to see. So.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is awesome. Patterns. The patterns that were from that, and this is my last question. The patterns from Chicago. Do you have copies of the patterns that were in the Chicago Daily Tribune, do you think?
Possibly. I'd have to go see what we have because we have indexed quite a few. I know we have a lot of the Kansas City Stars in complete sets, but I don't know about. I'll check the Chicago Trib and see.
Cool. Well, I'll send you a formal email and ask you, and then I would love to sort of be able to see example of what those are, so that I have a better sense of what they look like and how much is protectable and isn't on what they're doing. So it'd be super great. I'm so psyched to talk with you. You made my day.
Thank you.
I'm so excited. I mean, it's just it's such a great space to be talking and thinking about all of it. And I don't know, it's cool. So yes,
it's in my head all the time.
That's great. Well, if you start to think about any of this stuff particularly on copyright really is can everybody use it, or do you have to ask permission? That's the divide, right?
Do you know Paula Nadelstern and her copyright issues?
The one is at the rug,
the carpets in Houston.
Yes, I haven't gotten. I need to. Do you know her? I have to get connected to her. I would love for you to connect me with her because I would love to interview her. She
had a really successful case, and for many reasons. But I'm the only person I know that's really fought big business and found that they were taking her designs. They were using her book. It was right there on the design.
Oh, it's so great. We were in New York, and you couldn't get the complaint that Paula had filed online. We couldn't find it, but we went to the court and we got the original complaint because what happened is they filed so for people that don't know, so they not only did they take her designs and make them into rugs, but they put them at Houston
in the hotel.
In the hotel. So people literally looked down and was like, oh, and they're so recognizable. It was like, oh, that's Paula's design, right? So they sued. And then there was a really great counter to the suit, which was very clever. But then they settled. So it never went to court it just did that first part of it, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. But we couldn't get the complaint. So we went to the court, one of my research assistants, and we got the original complaint. So we're pretty psyched about that. And it has got the photographs and sort of all the stuff in it of why they were so upset about it. And they won. And then the company gave them, when they just pulled it out, right? So they've just finally pulled out the carpet. I think what we've heard is that they gave some of it to her when they pulled it out of the hotel. But yeah. Crazy. So yeah, I would love to talk with her. We're kind of obsessed with that case because it's as you said, one of the few ones that are, we have maybe 10 to 15 total on different levels, but that one is really interesting.
I will get you in touch with Paula.
Oh, I love it. Oh, cool. Awesome. Love it. All right. I want to come play. I'll see you. Take care.
Elizabeth. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
So you've been listening to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School. And I'm Elizabeth Townsend Gard. If you like this podcast, keep listening. Also, we have a Facebook group. Come join us. We talk about a lot of things. We also have an Instagram account. And of course, most importantly, I really hope you get a chance to quilt today.